Hey, it's Mattea. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen today. If you've been enjoying Bookends, why don't you give us a follow on your favorite podcast app? This will ultimately help us make more episodes and also connect you with more of your favorite authors. And don't forget to leave a review. It helps us get the word out to others who might enjoy the show. I hope you liked today's episode, and thanks again so much for listening. Hey there, welcome to Bookends. I'm Mattea Roach. In pop culture, young adulthood is often cast as a place of arrival. A place where you can do the things you've always wanted to do and live the life that you always imagined. But many of us know that crossing that threshold into adulthood can feel less like an arrival and more like a messy crash landing. There can be some confusing detours on the road to adulthood and some unexpected outcomes. Georgia Taves' new novel, Nobody Asked for This, goes right to the heart of this muddled and uncertain time in life. We meet our protagonist, Virginia. She's working as a comedian in Toronto, trying to figure out her career, while also coping with the loss of her mother and navigating tensions with friends and family. Author Georgia Taves lives in Toronto and joined me in our studio for this conversation. Hi, Georgia. Thank you for coming in.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. Yeah, it's exciting.
Now, while I was reading Nobody Asked for This, it felt very lived in, as though you have been in this comedian working in Toronto lifestyle, and then getting to the acknowledgments in the back, you say that your parents actually encouraged you to go to comedy school after dropping out of art school, which is an interesting, I think, not a lot of parents would necessarily be like, art school didn't work, let's go to comedy school. Why did they suggest comedy school?
Well, you know, my parents are hippies themselves. I mean, my mother's a writer. My father was a busker. Now he produces, children's festivals. So that was in their wheelhouse. And that's kind of how I grew up. I was a theater kid. And I loved it, especially improv and sketch comedy. And that was what I did. I was a performer. And I kind of stopped that, in high school, just desperately trying to be cool and failing. And when I went to art school, I still gravitated back. I kind of dropped all of these courses and just started taking theater courses. And then I thought, yeah, theater's the way to go, and auditioned for the National Theater School and did not get in. I did a Shakespeare piece. It was terrible. But I think they were like, okay, so maybe not drama, but comedy, that could work.
Now, Nobody Asked for This is not a memoir. It is a novel, but you're drawing on these experiences of having gone to comedy school, I think done some of the stand-up circuit in Toronto. How much of your own experience is in this novel with your character, Virginia?
A lot of my experience when I was that age, I haven't been involved in the comedy community for a long time. And I wanted to take the best of my experiences. Again, because I have a lot of not so great experiences within that community. But I really wanted to focus on, especially the women and her group of friends, and, not shying away from kind of the terribleness that exists. But I wanted to focus on when I was excited and when it was fun, and this idea of creating joy, which I still think I am trying to do in a different form, a different medium. And so I was really happy to kind of go back to that time.
So we've established, not a memoir, a novel. We've talked a bit about what led you to comedy for that period of your life where you were in comedy school doing a bit of stand-up. But for your character, Virginia, what is it that happens for her that leads her to take up comedy as a career and a practice?
I think after, the death of her mother, really, and her trying to find a way to find some sense of control with her grief. I mean, she was young when she lost her mother, and like any kind of young woman, especially, in high school, there's almost this embarrassment. I certainly felt of feeling too much, of, being dramatic about your feelings, that's so kind of ingrained. And I think especially for young women, this kind of hysteria, and Virginia wants, I think, so much to control that and, to seem brave, to seem strong, to work against that archetype. But she goes to comedy and she finds that this is a safe place for her, and this is how she can kind of survive and, pretend that she's controlling her grief.
I know for you, obviously, that sort of loss of a parent grief is not part of what took you to comedy, but did you feel at all that there were things in your life that you were trying to navigate through comedy during your early 20s journey with it?
I think I learned from a young age that comedy was a way to survive. I was a very insecure kid, and I remember at a birthday party, I was in grade 4 and a grade 6 girl invited me to her birthday party, and she was so cool. She could, draw really well, and that was what mattered. And all her friends were cool, and I was not talking to anyone. No one was talking to me. And I just started stuffing hot dogs in my mouth, like being this buffoon, this clown. And then suddenly, I was invited to the sleepover after. And that's maybe not a great example of just, kind of humiliating myself for to be liked. But, it was a moment that sticks out that I'm like, okay, I can laugh. I can put up this shield, and it makes me feel brave that, it's like, oh, I'm being funny. To a lot of people where they see that as a vulnerability, that makes me feel brave when I can do that. And so I've kind of kept that.
Is there something about being in your early 20s? As I mentioned earlier, your main character in Nobody Asked for This, Virginia, is 23 during the arc of this novel. And she, I think, is using comedy as a way to be brave and grapple with, as you mentioned, grief and some other difficult things that she's navigating. What is it about that period of life and the sort of struggles that people often go through when they're in that, let's say, like 18 to 25 period of life that made it feel like the right place to anchor this novel that centers so much on the comedy world?
I think for myself, like that's really when I was involved the most in the comedy world in my early 20s. And that for me was also, the age where I was going through so much turmoil and a lot more, with my own addictions and that sort of thing. So it was kind of like it was almost this redo for me where, I could kind of live in this character as if what if none of this had happened and I was just living in this character. And so I, maybe selfishly, I wanted to put her there and kind of navigate for myself, even processing my own life and my own 20s, what that would look like.
Yeah, I mentioned before we got on the mic for this interview, like this was a novel that for me as a reader, it felt a bit ouch to read because I've only just escaped, scratching and clawing my early 20s. I turned 25. I was like, thank God. I remember being like, my frontal lobe developed yet. But there were so many things going on in this novel, even though I was not hitting the comedy clubs really at all when I was in my early 20s, that did resonate with me. And one of them is this notion of friendships that have to withstand or are tested by both parties or all parties going through some major transformations and challenges in their life. And so much of Nobody Asked for This centers around this relationship that your character Virginia has with her roommate Haley, who she's known since they were teenagers and who's dealing with some pretty profound depression and mental health problems. What are some of the points of contention in this relationship between Virginia and Haley?
They're at this place where they have these versions of each other that they're really clinging to because, they both need that stability for themselves. They both need each other to be these versions that they feel the safest with. And so they're not really allowing each other to, evolve and grow. And they both, kind of resent each other in a way for going on these different paths because they are both suffering in their own ways. And with that, not that I believe women are in competition with each other, but I think because, they started off at this place together and now they're going on such different paths, it's hard not to compare when they're living together and what they're both dealing with and where does that stack up and who should be more supportive. And, in any friendship, it's hard to navigate life changes and these major events. But when you're in this kind of pressure cooker situation, it's just there's more of a spotlight on it. And I think they're really struggling with trying to be each other's safe space and wanting that from each other, but both falling short.
We've mentioned a couple of times some of these traditional signposts and milestones of early adulthood that have shifted quite a lot or become harder, I think, to pin down just due to economic conditions and changing social norms. You mentioned, having a kid and that being something that happens at different times. And you're like, wait, am I doing this too early? Or conversely, if you're somebody who waits a while to have kids, you might see your high school friends having kids and thinking like, wait a minute, what am I doing here? How do you know, or can you know, if you've arrived as an adult? I think a lot of people who are in this early mid-20s, even into 30s now, stage of life feel like they're faking it a little bit when it comes to adulthood.
Yeah. I don't know if I have still arrived. And I don't know what it means to be an adult. I mean, I pay taxes. I vote. The things you can do as an adult. But I don't know. And even having kids, kind of hitting that, getting married, all these things that, we feel we're supposed to do. I always wanted to have children. So I was, I knew that was going to happen at whatever age. But I don't know if I've ever reached full adulthood. I feel younger now. I mean, I'm tired a lot because I have 2 children. But, I feel younger watching them. And I feel younger, I think the only thing I can say that maybe I've reached some sense of adulthood is I feel more at peace with myself. So I'm able to enjoy being the age I am more. And I feel, less insecure about getting to be somewhere, hitting some goalpost. So, I mean, maybe that's some sort of sign of adulthood.
How do you think you got there, that sense of being at peace with yourself?
Therapy and just time. I mean, it's been a lot of work. I got sober at 25. And then it was kind of like reliving my 20s all at once, my early 20s, but through a different lens. And then had my first kid at 28. So it was kind of this crash course. And I do like to do things very impulsively and quickly. So I don't know how I arrived at that place, but I think it was just out of necessity. I think it was just time for me to, either make peace with myself and realize, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to live, or, return to some sort of terrible self-sabotage path. And then I'm not going to do that.
Hey, and welcome back to Bookends. Just a heads up before we get into the rest of my conversation with Georgia Taves, this next part deals with sexual assault, so please take care while listening. Georgia, there's this major moment in your novel when Virginia goes on a date with a fellow comedian who's older and he's more established in his career. He is mostly working in LA. He got on this Netflix special. He has some of these markers of success within the context of the comedy world. And Virginia goes on a date with him and he assaults her quite violently. How does Virginia make sense of what happened to her? And how does that also change through the novel? Because we kind of live in her perspective as it's happening, but then also see her reflecting back on it and trying to make sense of it later.
Yeah, I mean, I think she makes sense of it, in the way that unfortunately so many women do, in a very non-linear way. And she has support and she pushes away support. It's almost like going through the stages of grief in dealing with an assault like that, because there is so much that she can grapple with, that she can, deny, and then she can come back and, say, no, it didn't feel like that. And it's so hard, and that's why I wrote that scene the way I did. So there would be to really capture that feeling of, going through an assault like that, and trying to process those feelings of, why did this happen to me? Could I have done something? And all these questions that unfortunately we ask ourselves, even though it's not, the victim is never to blame at all, but we go through this. And I wanted to honestly portray that, because I just felt like it was important to show that there are no wrong ways to experience the aftermath to the questions. She asks herself, am I a bad feminist for the way I'm dealing with this? Because there's so many expectations on young people, on young women. And you add in these these events like this that happen, and there's just no clear path, and I don't know if there's enough support, and I think she's just really trying her best. So I don't know how she processes it and how she gets there. I think she just kind of bulldozes her way through these stages of grief, really.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the idea of stages of grief, because obviously there's like a compound grief then that Virginia is experiencing, where she actually even at one point in the novel is kind of comparing the grief of what have I lost after being assaulted to, well, is this as bad as my mom dying, which is kind of a wild comparison because the two things have nothing to do with each other. What is the kind of association that she's making in her mind there? Because I think a lot of people, when they're dealing with compound grief of whatever 2 or 3 or more events those might be, end up connecting events that are not causally linked in a way where they become a comparison or they become somehow related in the mind.
Well, I was really focusing on the idea of grief itself being an intrusion, and of that loss of autonomy, and as I said, Virginia, she just wants to have a sense of control, to have a sense of power, and she lost that when her mother died, and then again in this assault, these things were out of her control, and I think she compares the two because even the residual grief from her mother, or the grief that will always be there, she can't control when it kind of washes up on her, and it is intrusive, and it is an assault on her mind, on her body, the way she feels it. And so I think comparing them and trying to figure out, which should she be more upset about, which should she be actively processing is just a way of trying to find some semblance of control and trying to feel organized in your own mind, just so, you can feel like you still have a handle on things.
You mentioned also the idea that there's no right or wrong way to deal with an assault. And we see Virginia kind of trying to navigate this. There's this one scene where she just like sees a cop on the street outside her local coffee shop and goes up and kind of asks like, can I report an assault but like not do a whole court proceeding? Can I just say, hey, this happened? What did you want to navigate there? I think there's this idea that some people sometimes have that because Me Too happened, we've like solved this issue of now you can report sexual assault and it's easy. But obviously that's not really true.
Yeah. And that's really what I wanted to focus on, just how messy it is and how much, onus there still is on the victim of this, because they have to navigate all of that. They have to know. And she talks about how she wishes she knew what that would look like to report it, what it would look like to even publicly say something, to call this guy out, whether it's on social media or whatever, because you just don't know. And I think even after Me Too, there's almost been this pendulum swing where now we have a bigger spotlight on like, is this true? And, we believe, all victims, but just in the state the world is, and it's terrifying. And as a young person going through that, it would be nice, again, to have this sense of control, to know the outcome and the consequences, and just trying to go into that blindly and say, well, I would like some accountability. I would like someone to tell me it's okay, but what does that mean for me? Is this actually a safe path? And I don't think it always is, and I don't mean that to dissuade anyone, if they've been through something like that, to not report it, to not talk about it, but I do want to highlight that the fear of doing that in any way, shape, or form is very real and very valid.
This desire to make it and struggle towards success is such a big thing in Nobody Asked for This, because so many of the characters are working comedians. And there's this examination of the entertainment industry in Canada and the notion that people are scrambling for a limited amount of opportunities, and that if you want to be a serious comedian, you've got to go to Los Angeles. Can you tell me more about that? And also maybe comment on, right now is a weird time to be having this conversation, because what it means to move to America as a Canadian in 2025, I think, is very different than it maybe was at the time you were writing this book.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, nothing like this was happening when I was writing this book. I wrote it, I think, in 2022. So it was much more, it was a much better dream to move to America. But I still think that for comedians that I do know, they still want to go over there and do comedy because there still are more opportunities. There's just a bigger comedy scene in the States for the white male comics that I know. Yeah, they're not worried about going. I think in Canada I think now is a good time for Canadian comics because I think we want to kind of foster that. We want people to stay and we want people, to succeed in Canada. And I think hopefully the only slim silver lining is that maybe there will be more support for comedy and the arts in Canada because we have so many great people and we, want to celebrate that.
Yeah. It's interesting, we love in Canada to talk about our famous people who made it in America, maybe more than we do our own local celebrities. And specifically within comedy, I think a lot of the Canadian celebrities that we point to as examples of look who went away and made it are specifically comedians. You look at Eugene and Dan Levy, Catherine O'Hara, Lorne Michaels literally creating SNL, Martin Short, a younger person who's not an older white guy, Celeste Yim, SNL writer that I went to school with, actually. Why are there so many famous Canadian comics actually working in the States? I feel like specifically we punch above our weight in this portion of the entertainment industry.
I mean, Canadians are just funnier. I'll say that. I don't know why. Maybe because we just have to live through so much cold weather.
You need something
hardy.
to do.
Yeah, we need something to talk about when we're just inside. And I don't know why. It just seems like it's always been this end goal that I've seen, and that's what I when I wrote about it. So many comics, that was just the goal, either New York or LA, and now it's it's Austin, and I don't know if that's just marketing that you want to go to New York because that's where SNL is. You want to go to Chicago, for the Groundlings or Second City. But there are so many funny comedians, and I wish I could understand why they keep going over there because they should stay here and keep making funny things here. But I mean, luckily, on CBC, there's a lot of funny Canadians on a lot of funny shows. So
that's true. Yeah,
I'll plug that for you.
Why do people go? Well, the U.S. dollar exchanges really nicely back into Canadian dollars, as I can attest.
I mean, there's more money, there's more opportunity, and yeah, like I said, I wish there was more here, but all you can do is just keep being funny, and eventually they'll get it. It's like that Steve Martin. He has a great joke. They may not get it right now, but on their way home when they're driving, that's when they're going to laugh.
Click, yeah.
Yeah, 10 years from now, we'll be like, Canadians were so funny. Why did they keep going over there?
Yeah. One thing on this note of people wanting to move, there's the physical emptying of homes manifests in this book quite a lot. We have Virginia and Haley possibly moving out of their shared apartment. Virginia is also going through this process of clearing out her family home because, it's now been years since her mom passed away, and her mom's former partner is thinking, maybe I don't want to live in this kind of museum to my deceased love anymore. What did you want to tap into with all of this literal examination of going through boxes of old clothes and photos and stuff? This was as somebody who just helped my mom downsize pretty recently, this was a very real part of the novel for me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hate packing and I hate moving. So I was like, I should write about this to try and deal with that. And I think it tells a lot about a person. We were just moving stuff around in our basement so our kids could skate down there, practice ollies. And we have just so many boxes of things. And, and even when we were moving back, we were living in Huntsville during the pandemic and we were moving home. And it was packing up and wondering, how to place weight and, what is important to keep, to preserve. And I'm not a very material person, and my husband is, and that was just such a point of contention because he has his 8th grade basketball trophy. He's like, well, that's got to come with us. I'm like, why? And I think it's so interesting, and it tells us a lot about a person, what we hold on to and what we're willing to walk away from, and what we really need to hold on to someone and to a memory of a thing. And again, because I think Virginia carries so much guilt of how she processes anything, and especially her mother's death, that was a good way to show the contrast, really, of her packing up her mother's home and kind of, finally having this moment that she is confident in what she has of her mother, and that, is a really nice moment for her, a nice kind of moment of closure. And further on in the book, I think we see that kind of mirrored, that she has, again, this sense of peace. And I liked that could kind of show that she was actually finally confident in one of her choices.
We're talking about, mother-daughter relationships a little bit, and this experience of kind of family memories. I've buried the lead a little bit in this conversation that your mom is actually Miriam Toews, who, of course, is an acclaimed novelist in her own right. And I know that when you set out to write your first novel, Hey, Good Luck Out There, she did give you some advice about writing what you know. But how much has advice from your mom or your relationship with her informed your writing?
It's tough to say. I mean, because I think everything has. I mean, just watching her as a kid and understanding that this was a way of survival. This was a process that she needed to do. Not for acclaim or success, but just that this was a practice that she needed to do. It's funny because we don't talk about writing with each other a lot, and I think our relationship, it's so funny now because she is, she's grandma now and she's very happy about that. And it's funny when people talk about Miriam Toews, the writer, because even though, I watched her and, I'm obviously so proud and I know how incredibly talented she is and I'm just very lucky to be around that. We've had such a different relationship as mother-daughter. So really when I started to write, she did give me good advice. And it was funny because she was probably struggling with the mother writer role because, she never wants to tell me anything bad. She's just like, oh, you're perfect. You're my little angel. I love you. That's not how she talks. But she really, she was kind in her kind of critique of Hey, Good Luck Out There. And then with Nobody Asked for This, it was really, just trusting that, what she had said is right what you know, and really leaning into that. And this process, she read a draft, but she really was just, it was just kind of having her there as support, maybe not editorial, but I really needed that as someone to go to talk to and be like, oh, I'm struggling with just the idea of writing, but not necessarily like the details of what I was writing.
Yeah. There's a quote also at the start of your book that comes from Hannah Gadsby's memoir, and it's, coping takes a ton more effort and energy than thriving ever will. What does that quote mean to you, and why did you want to attach it to this novel?
I think, I don't know who is thriving right now. And I don't know, maybe they're just blissfully unaware of the world. But I think it's true to cope, to stay, in this kind of place of survival and, wanting to move forward and feeling the weight of everything, of existence, of living, of being a young person in this world. That's a lot. And it's hard work and it's invisible work. And, and that deserves to be kind of acknowledged, that it's great if you get past that and you're just, living life on a yacht. But that doesn't seem very difficult to me. It's, it's the grind in between and being able to cope. To me, that also means to find joy in kind of that, that kind of grindy battle day to day, and be able to play and have fun still. And I think all of that takes so much effort and work, and that should be highlighted.
Georgia, thank you so much for coming in to chat with me today. I've had so much fun.
Thank you for having me.
That was Georgia Toews, the author of Nobody Asked for This. She joined me in our Toronto studio. This episode was produced by Liv Pasquarelli. Ailey Yamamoto is our associate producer. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. Shout out to our audio tech Aronde Williams and to the entire CBC Books team. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.